So now that we've had a chance to play around with the Cinema 4D interface, to create some parametric primitives, to select our objects in the object manager, maybe delete them, and navigate our space by panning, orbiting, and zooming or dollying in and out, I want to leave you with just a couple of additional thoughts that's really about workflow, and just remind you of a couple of things that we just did to really reinforce some good habits inside Cinema 4D. I'm going to delete all of these objects that I have on screen, and I'll do that just by simply selecting them and hitting the delete key. Now, inside Cinema 4D, there are some default tools that we always want to use. If we don't have a compelling reason to change our tools, we always want to be using the Move tool. And you can find the Move tool just to the left of the Scale tool. So make sure that by default the Scale tool is the Move tool is selected. On the left side of our component menu, we have our object or our model tool selected. Okay? And so in the event that you're clicking around and you inadvertently click on one of these tools, just make sure that you go back to the model tool. So this will be our default setup. We have the Move tool selected, we have our model tool selected, and now we can get to the task of creating parametric primitives. I'll create a cube. This is called a parametric primitive because it's a primitive geometric object. In this case, it's a cube, and it's a primitive object that's governed by a set of parameters. So it's a parametric or a parameter-driven cube in this case, or it's a parametric primitive. I can change the parameters of this object as we discovered in the previous presentation just by playing around with some of these values. We're going to ignore segmentation for now until we get into some modeling. Whenever you're modifying the parametric primitive, you want to be focused on the Object tab. In the event that you're clicking around the Attributes Manager, you may inadvertently click on Basic, Coordinate, or Fong. By default, you want to be looking at the Object Manager. Once you govern those parameters and change those and modify your object, you can gain a lot of control and be very precise about this. Once we decide that we want to start moving objects around, and I'll just introduce a sphere, it's really important that we're only moving this object according to one axis. If I want to stack this sphere on top of this cube, again, I'm just going to roll over the y-axis and click and drag. By clicking and dragging on a given axis, it allows us to be really sloppy with the mouse, and it restricts that motion to one axis. This is probably one of the most important things that you can learn when you just start 3D modeling, is to move content only to one axis at a time. And I can confirm, I can do a quick audit, I can select my cube and look at its position coordinates, and I can say, yep, I did not move that cube in any way, shape, or form. It's still at the origin. If I make another shape, I'll just make this oil tank here, it exists at 0, 0, 0. I'll delete that oil tank and I'll go back to my cube. I can look down here and say, yep, I did not move that object. If I click the sphere, I can say, yep, I moved it according to the y-axis, so I moved it up, and that's exactly what I wanted to do. And I moved that up, if I look here, I moved that up at almost 200 centimeters. Okay, and that's sitting almost perfectly on top of that cube. Not quite, I'm a little low. I bet there's a little bit of an intersection. And in fact, if I hold down the Option key and I click and drag and I flatten out my view, I get a better sense of the relationship between those two objects, and I get a sense that, yeah, there's a little bit of overlap down there. A little bit, I can see it a little bit better than when I was from this strong perspective. So a lot of times when we're making stuff and arranging stuff in space, we're going to want to make sure that we navigate around our scene and take a look at it from a couple different directions. So those are some of the basic concepts in Cinema 4D that we need to wrap our head around with. It's okay if this process feels a little bit clumsy. There's going to be no substitute for experience when it comes to using Cinema 4D. So we'll get started. In our next presentation, we'll get started on a simple illustration of a snowman, and we'll use that project as a platform to take a deeper dive into some of the tools in Cinema 4D. We'll talk about staging and lighting our scenes, and we'll start to apply textures as well. So we'll do that. So look to the Project 1. Make sure that you're familiar with this process and this tour of the interface before you get started, and we'll take a deeper dive in Project 1. And we'll do that in the next presentation.